All right. So hello, everyone. My name is Abby Courier, and I'm the Community Engagement and Events Coordinator here at the History Center of Olmsted County. I'm so excited to see everyone on here tonight, and I look forward to learning more this evening about the Wax Models and Medical Museum at the Mayo Clinic. Here at the History Center of Olmsted County, we invite people to gather, socially distanced of course, and explore and examine our past as we educate ourselves about the stories of Olmsted County in southeastern Minnesota. We are so excited that you have decided to join us tonight as we take a look at one of these stories. Tonight, we're going to have a presentation from Karen Coca on the Wax Models and Medical Museum at the Mayo Clinic. After her presentation, we will have about 15 minutes for questions from the audience. During the presentation, feel free to drop any questions you may have in the chat, and we will try to answer as many of them as we can. But before we get started, I just want to go over a couple of logistical things. For tonight, we are going to keep all of you muted so that we can listen to our speaker. Like I said, if you have any questions throughout the presentation, put them into the chat and we will do our best to answer as many of them as we can. We may also put some links into the chat throughout the night, so make sure you keep an eye on it. Anything that we put into the chat, we will be sure to send to you tomorrow, along with a quick survey about tonight's program. It will take you less than 2 minutes to fill out, and we really appreciate your feedback. We also recommend watching this in presenter view. But if you want to see everyone participating Brady Bunch style, you can do that by clicking on presentation view in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. If you are joining us from an iPad, you may have to swipe a couple of times to join the view, to change the view. We are recording tonight's program, so please keep that in mind. We are so excited about tonight's talk and hope that you will continue to join us for some of our future events, where we will talk about everything from women in World War II, to wastewater treatment right here in Rochester, to voting rights in Minnesota, and everything in between. These talks are one of the many great benefits to having a membership to the History Center of Olmsted County. We certainly hope that you will continue to join us for these talks, and we also hope that you will consider getting a membership to experience even more benefits. Tonight, we are joined by Karen Coca, who received her Bachelor of Arts degree in 1984 from the University of Utah, a Master of Arts in History from the University of Michigan in 1988, and an MLIS also from Michigan in 1989. She has worked with archives and special collections for 31 years, including the University of Michigan Special Collections Library, the Nebraska State Historical Society, and in her present position as an archivist with the Mayo Clinic W. Bruce Fye Center for the History of Medicine. She is also an instructor in the History of Medicine at the Mayo Clinic Alex School of Medicine. Karen?
Well, thank you, Abby. I appreciate the invitation and the chance to speak tonight. I'm wishing that we were in an auditorium together, because I'd ask people to raise their hands and see how many people remember going through the museum when they were young. But maybe that's something, yes, I can see at least one hand. So it's kind of interesting, especially with this audience, that there are probably many people who have. At any rate, thanks again, Abby, for that introduction, and we'll get started. According to Professor Dr. Thomas Schnelke of the Berlin Medical Museum, anatomical wax models, also known as moulages, are not only impressive three-dimensional study aids, but witnesses to a highly developed art of medical teaching. They represent works of considerable cultural and medical historical value. The Mayo Clinic produced and is home to a large collection of anatomical wax models. Created in-house, the models were for decades a fundamental tool of Mayo medical education. In this presentation, you will see how the use of models began at Mayo Clinic, their role in the creation of the Mayo Medical Museum, how the models and exhibits were made, some unique aspects of the Mayo model collection, and a little bit of old-fashioned show and tell. But first, a brief introduction to the use of wax as a medium for anatomical models. The use of wax for creating works of art dates back millennia and is itself a subject of scholarly investigation. For example, in pre-Christian Rome, ancestral portraits sculpted in wax were set up in the atria of elite homes and used in funerals. The photograph on the left shows a patrician, a Roman patrician statue, and in it he's carrying a portrait of wax. On the right is a medieval wax votive offering used to ask for grace or to give thanks. Such figures are also of ancient origin, and they are seen in some churches to the present day. Reference to the use of wax in medical education dates back to medieval times, but the true era of anatomical wax modeling began in Italy in the late 17th century and spread throughout Europe during the 18th century. The origins of anatomical waxes lay firstly in the need to provide more visual information than was possible in the two-dimensional illustrations then available, and secondly, in the lack of effective preservation techniques for cadavers, which made dissection of deteriorating bodies highly unpleasant. In addition, religious and legal restrictions on procurement of human bodies made their use problematic and also affected their availability. Above all, wax models have the advantage of being very lifelike, true to color, and portable. By the early 20th century, when our Mayo story begins, anatomical models were a well-established educational tool. Dr. Kenji Hayama, a Japanese dentist and resident in dental surgery at Mayo Clinic from 1924 to 1927, created the first Mayo models for the section of dental surgery. Dr. Hayama received his DDS degree in 1921 from the Nippon Dental College, but his instructor in the art of anatomical modeling is unknown. Wax modeling techniques had originally been brought to Japan by Dr. Kieitsu Dohi after 1895, when he had studied with Dr. Karl Henning in Vienna. On his return to Japan, Dr. Dohi, a professor of dermatology at the University of Tokyo, taught many early Japanese moulage artists. Dr. Hayama may have learned from either Dohi himself or one of his proteges. In 1922, Hayama earned an American DDS degree from Georgetown University. In June 1924, he joined the Mayo Clinic as a dental surgery resident, arriving in Rochester at the invitation of Dr. Boyd Gardner, the head of Mayo's section of dental surgery. In his reminiscences, Dr. Gardner wrote, "About 1924, I met Kenji Hayama, a Japanese dentist in Washington, D.C. He was doing excellent work representing in moulages pathologic conditions involving teeth and their adjoining structures. I induced him to come to Rochester. His ability to reproduce in wax both color and depth was outstanding. He furnished us with material that could be shown to visiting dentists, and furthermore, I could carry it with me whenever I was to appear on a dental program." Dr. Gardner's 1925 section report to the Mayo Board of Governors confirms his memory of the model's impact. The work of Kenji Hayama in producing models of pathologic conditions of the oral cavity and of the technique employed in doing the surgery necessary to remove especially difficult teeth needs no comment, as it is quite generally known by the staff. They have been used as clinic material for exhibits at different conventions, and tremendous interest has been shown, which has given the clinic publicity, the value of which cannot be overestimated. This slide shows examples of Dr. Hayama's models, illustrating both how they can be used to depict sequential steps in a procedure, and that Mayo used them in such step-by-step series as a teaching technique from the very beginning. Another example of Dr. Hayama's work shows the versatility of wax and the detail that could be achieved. In 2018, Dr. Kiyoshi Koyano, a prosthodontist in Fukuoka, Japan, generously responded to my request to look for information about Dr. Hayama's career after his Mayo Clinic residency. Dr. Koyano discovered that on Hayama's return to Japan, he became a professor at the Tokyo Medical and Dental University. He retired in 1960, though he continued to serve as dentist to the Hirohito family, the imperial family of Japan, until 1969. His hobbies included fishing and reading books. But it was not just the dental surgery section that recognized the usefulness of models. The 1926 annual report of the section on dermatology also confirms the clinic's commitment to making models. We will continue to develop the collection of moulages, which was started by Dr. Kenji Hayama. In the same year, the Division of Pathologic Anatomies report reflects Dr. Hayama's influence as well. The need of a capable modeler in wax is demonstrated by the beautiful work of Dr. Hayama, formerly associated with Dr. Gardner's department. Dr. Will Mayo was noted for taking swift action when the clinic required new skills. He chose Nellie Starkson, a Rochester native, to fill this particular need. She later told a reporter that she had intended to become an interior decorator and was attending the Minneapolis School of Art. But Dr. Will Mayo switched her plans. One summer vacation, when she was earning extra money in the Mayo Clinic, he suggested she try making wax models. If you decide to continue, Dr. Will went on, I'll see that you study under the best teacher there is. That best teacher was Kenji Hayama. Ms. Starkson created her first wax model exhibit for the American Medical Association meeting in 1925 and remained with the Mayo Clinic until 1936, when she joined the staff of the Field Museum in Chicago as an artist preparator. By 1933, the clinic was making large numbers of models each year. We don't yet know how many models remain in our current collection, but we are creating an inventory as we clean and rehouse them. Our tentative estimate is 1,500 to 1,800 models. The 1933 Century of Progress International Exposition in Chicago was a milestone for the history of wax models at Mayo Clinic. The fair's theme was technological innovation, designed to give Americans a glimpse of a post-Depression world made better by science and technology. The exposition also brought a young man to Rochester who would prove to be among the clinic's most remarkable staff recruits, Dr. Arthur Buboulian. The minutes of the Mayo Clinic Board of Governors meetings provide a great deal of information about the clinic's approach to the exposition. During its meeting of February 25, 1931, Dr. Henry Plummer, Mayo's expert in diseases of the thyroid gland, first called the attention of the board to the fact that there would be medical exhibits at the World's Fair. By August 1931, the board had decided to accept an invitation to participate, providing it had been approved by the American Medical Association. Further, it was felt that no expense or effort should be spared to prepare a very representative and unusual exhibit. In December 1931, the board approved an appropriation of up to $50,000 to cover expenses. They also appointed staff physicians George Brown and Walter Alvarez to gather information for exhibit planning, and most likely also to explore how much it might cost. In January 1932, the committee was finalized to include Dr. B.T. Terry, with Dr. Henny Plummer and Dr. Harold Robertson as advisors. The board minutes record that the sum of $10,000 was appropriated for the exhibit, which would be about $265,000 in today's money. This was notable both for the amount of money committed to the project and because it was done in the midst of the Great Depression. At its December 16th, 1931 meeting, the board recognized that it might be necessary to secure a man from the outside to take charge of the preparations. Dr. Alvarez headed the search. Looking back in a 1963 letter to clinic press officer Dr. James Ekman, Alvarez described how he found his man. I asked around the place whom I had better see, and Dr. Harold Robertson advised me to see sweet old Dr. Roberts in Minneapolis. He was referring to Thomas Sadler Roberts, a retired physician who had taken an unpaid post as associate curator of the state's Natural History Museum at the University of Minnesota, where the museum was located. So, Dr. Alvarez continued, I drove up there and saw him and told him my problem. He immediately said, come, and I'll introduce you to a gifted young Armenian who just graduated here in dentistry, but who does not want to be a dentist. He studied dentistry only because his family doubted if he could make a living as a museum man, and that's what he wants to be. On February 24th, 1932, the board minutes record, upon the recommendation of Dr. Alvarez, Dr. Arthur Babulian, now working with Dr. Tom Roberts in Minneapolis and in the dental department of the University of Minnesota, was appointed as an assistant in preparing an exhibit for the Century of Progress. This appointment is for a period of 8 months, beginning June 1st, 1932, at a salary of $250 per month. On March 22nd, 1933, a detailed report on the finalized exhibits was entered into the board minutes. The following excerpts describe the roles played by the models. The Mayo Foundation was asked to tell the story of a century of progress in man's knowledge of the functions, the diseases, and the treatment of 1. Diseases of the digestive tract, 2. The thyroid gland, and 3. The sympathetic nervous system. The information is presented with the help of transparent photographs, wax models, charts, motion pictures, and lantern slides. A series of wax models show the more important steps in the technique of operations on the stomach, colon, appendix, and gallbladder. A large model of the thyroid gland has been made in wax, and 7 lifelike masks show the appearance of patients with different types of goiter and thyroid gland deficiency. Dr. Babulian and his team had designed and created the different series of life-sized wax models from careful observation of Mayo surgeons at work. His models were so realistic that some exposition visitors in Chicago actually fainted. The fainting occurred so often that he needed a supply of smelling salts on hand, which he charged to his expense budget. The business office of the clinic in Rochester protested until the need for the smelling salts at the exhibit was carefully explained. Babulian stayed in Chicago to oversee the exhibit while the fair was in progress. Mayo Fellows served as demonstrators in 2-week shifts at a salary of $2.50 per day, in addition to housing. The pay was soon raised to $3. In this image, you'll see the thyroid models at the back of the exhibit space. You'll see them again later in the presentation. In a letter to the board entered into the minutes of August 9th, 1933, Dr. Alvarez reported, "One of the head guides told me that more people in the Hall of Science asked them about the Mayo Clinic exhibit than about any other." In this slide, the appendix model series is in the back center of the exhibit space. And here are the appendectomy models, from opening incision to closing sutures. Dr. Bouboulien's excellent work for the expedition did not go unnoticed. In 1991, he reminisced that when Dr. Will had visited the Mayo exhibit in Chicago, the famous surgeon had looked specifically for Bouboulian. He recalled Dr. Will casually saying, "Bouboulian, nice show. You are staying with us, aren't you?" Though surprised, the younger man thanked him very much and confirmed that he did indeed want to stay on at the Mayo Clinic and do the same type of work that he had been doing. To which Dr. Will replied, "Of course, that can be arranged." When Bouboulian went to Rochester soon afterward, Harry Harwick, the clinic's business manager, called him to his office and said, "Art, you are on the staff." This list shows a few of Dr. Bouboulien's career highlights. He was a wax model artist, and in addition, the co-inventor of the first modern American oxygen mask in 1938. This was a prototype for both high-altitude flight and medical oxygen delivery. He was a maxillofacial prostheses pioneer, so he actually did get to use his dental degree. And he was an organizational member of the founding group for the American Academy of Maxillofacial Prosthetics in 1951. In 1933, largely due to the success of the Mayo exhibit at the Chicago Exposition, Dr. Will authorized the creation of a Mayo Medical Museum in Rochester. The story, also recorded in Dr. Alvarez's 1963 reminiscence letter to Dr. Ekman, is a wonderful illustration of Dr. Will at work. Then one day in 1932 or 1933, I said to Dr. Will, "Why, when we spend thousands of dollars making exhibits for several big medical societies, do we afterwards throw them into a big room in the back of the power plant and let them go to ruin? Why don't we make a museum and put those exhibits in it? Then when we get our exhibits back from Chicago in a year or two, we will have a permanent place for them." Dr. Will said, with his immediate decisiveness, "Good idea. Take the first floor of the school building across the way. Call Ellerby's man this afternoon and go to work tomorrow morning." This was just before noon. By the next morning, and 4 phone calls from Dr. Will later, Dr. Alvarez had the project underway with the assistance of Dr. Henry Plummer and Ellerby Architects, a firm based in St. Paul, Minnesota, that had collaborated with Plummer to design both the 1914 and 1928 clinic buildings. Later, when Dr. Will saw the size of the crowds that poured in, he called Alvarez and said, "I'm moving Cruzen out of the second floor, so now you can take the whole building." And that is what was done. Frank Cruzen, by the way, founded the Medical School of Physical Therapy and was known nationwide as the father of physical medicine. Dr. Bouboulian, that gifted young Armenian, was named the first director of the museum. In his first annual report to the Board of Governors in 1935, he noted that one of the founding objectives of the museum was to routinely make wax casts or models of interesting medical, surgical, and pathological cases for future use in exhibits. In addition to Dr. Bouboulian, these are some core artists who created the museum's collection over the years. Leonard Knudsen, lead artist, was the first medical sculptor elected to membership in the American Association of Medical Illustrators. Martin Ressler was a talented visual designer and wax artist. Nita Case spent her Mayo career working on models for exhibits. And Peter McConaughey, who is still working at Mayo, made the last in-house models in 1983. So we'll look a little bit at making a model. This is the first page of Mayo's instructions for making models. The formula requires beeswax, paraffin, cornstarch, and talc. Plaster of Paris molds could be made directly from patients, from specimens, or from a sculpture created in clay. Pictured here are examples of some of the specialized tools used to shape a clay model. Model making at its most basic involves creating the plaster mold, pouring wax into the mold, additional surface sculpting when the mold is removed, and finally painting. The Archives has a 16-minute film from 1938 in which Dr. Bobulian, Leonard Knudsen, and associates demonstrate their model-making techniques. We'll watch them create a series of wax torsos that reveal progressive levels of human anatomy, moving from the outside in, literally from skin to skeleton. I've edited the film to 5 minutes, keeping only the most basic steps. The beginning shows the team making a master mold that will be used for all 5 torsos, then the sculpting of details on the 3rd torso. And finally, the next part shows the wax casting process for the 1st torso. So enjoy the show. And there is no sound, but I will point out a few things while it's running. Are we moving? There we go. So here is a young man who volunteered to be the person that they make the plaster cast on. They did have a special type of a salve that they put on the skin to make removal easier. And I'm not sure how long that he was in those molds, but I did think that he actually, someone mentioned that he fell asleep at one point. So it must have been quite a long time. And here we go with the face. So that's Dr. Bobulian on the left, Fred Mayhew on the right, and part of Leonard Knudsen in back. And things kind of magically appear as we go through the process. And here is the clay form. And Dr. Bobulian is sculpting details onto the clay. And if you look closely at his tools, you'll recognize them. We're not sure, but the tools you saw before could actually be Dr. Bobulian's tools. You'll see that in a minute. These torsos are some of the largest models that we have in the collection. And I think that might be one reason why they filmed this, because it was pretty spectacular to have such large wax models being made. And this is Dr. Bobulian using the tools. We've moved from the outside through the chest muscles and into the interior of the abdomen. And these just show a little bit of the incredible detail of the work in clay. This is something we didn't know before about these models, that there was balsa wood inside them, but of course the wax on its own wouldn't be enough to stand up. when the wax is removed from a mold, where there are seams where the mold has been put together will be some rough edges, and these need to be smoothed and sculpted away. And finally, here's a view of all 5 of the models as they move again from the outside through various stages, various levels of the human body. This is that 3rd model that you saw in clay. Moving ever more deeply into the abdomen. And finally to the spine. A large percentage of the models were made specifically for display at medical meetings. The Mayo exhibits frequently received awards for excellence. We're going to go through the creation of an exhibit, and it's very similar to what you just viewed in the film, but on a much smaller scale. And these are the more typical of the models that we have in the collection. In this first sequence, the following sequence show a glimpse of the complicated work needed to produce an exhibit in addition to the models. And in this case, they're making the granuloma of the lung exhibit for the 1950 American Medical Association meeting. So here's Mr. Knudsen and Martin Ressler pouring a wax into the plaster mold. Mr. Knudsen removing that lung part from the mold, and then sculpting the model to add more details and painting it using a pathology specimen as a guide. So these are a few pictures of the staff working to make the exhibit. You'll see the blueprints are being looked at to create the frame for the exhibit. Mr. Ressler is making the exhibit signage, and they also usually had electricity included for various lighting effects. So not only did the Mayo team create the models, the signage, the lighting, and the cases for the exhibits, they also traveled to the meetings to assemble them. So you can see that here's the granuloma exhibit at the meeting, ready to have people come in and take a look. And here's a detail of one of the lung models on exhibit with label text in 1950. And this is that same model today. Shortly before his retirement in 1965, Dr. Bouboulian published an instructional booklet, Planning and Preparing Scientific Exhibits. He illustrated the process with photographs of several series of models. Here are 2 surgical models that he included. This is surgery on the parotid gland, and the final model from a plastic surgery sequence. So there are some unique aspects of the Mayo model collection. And among the most vivid and unique of our models are 5 that portray farm accidents. 3 sets show traumatic injuries before and after surgery, while 2 depict only the injury. The left side of this photograph shows 2 of the before and after groups. And here are the images of the actual models. So these are hands where the fingers were caught in a corn shredder. Another accident with farm machinery in the hands. a corn picker accident, and one of the single models that shows a foot injured when the person attempted to force fodder into a feed mill. The last model is known to our staff simply as the farm accident. Initially, we thought that it depicted an accident documented in several Minnesota newspapers and the 1910 Mayo autopsy record book. Jumping from the top of a stack of grain in the harvest field, R.C. Davidson met a horrible death when the handle of a pitchfork penetrated his abdomen a distance of 14 inches. However, we now know as a staff that this accident predates 1924, the year in which the first Mayo model was made by Kenji Hayama. Here's the model, and it was possible that it was created years later from descriptions of the 1910 accident, or perhaps another accident of the same nature occurred at a time when clinic artists were available to document it in wax. Another notable aspect of the Mayo collection is that most models were made from real cases, though not all have identifying patient numbers. Other institutions internationally do not have this kind of record and are trying to match early 20th century models in their collections to cases published in medical journals, a process that has had only limited success so far. Whenever a model has a patient identifying number, the corresponding medical records and other file materials related to that case can, with Institutional Review Board permission, be reviewed. The following is a remarkable example. Hospital and surgical records, photographs, and some correspondence were available for this case. In January 1945, the referring doctor wrote to the clinic that this patient shows one of the most spectacular dermatoses I have ever seen. The first Mayo Clinic visit was July 10th, 1946. Her mother reported that the patient was age 3 at onset, and a number of children in the community had ringworm in scalp or on body. Although the other children responded to treatment, the patient did not. She was age 10 when she came to Mayo, having suffered with the infection for 7 years. The records show that she required numerous blood transfusions to treat secondary anemia. On December 19, 1946, Mayo Clinic doctor Louis Brunsting summarized the case in a letter to one of the referring physicians. She was confined to the hospital for 157 days, ending December 11, 1946. She has widespread fungus infection. Our mycologist found Monillia albicans in the mouth, gastrointestinal tract, and stools, and also from the hands and fingernails. The fungus on the glabrous surfaces everywhere else, and there was plenty, was Microsporum canis. Detailed surgical notes describe the procedure in the Wirral Hospital that removed the crusts on October 29, 1946. The thickened crusts were removed with gentle traction and the bleeding granulating bases scraped with a scalpel. The face, forehead, both ears, and the anterior part of the scalp were done this morning. Clinic social services staff kept the child as active as she could be during her treatment and also wrote letters to her family for her when she could not. On November 1st, 1946, 3 days after surgery, social worker Evelyn Parker wrote the following. She was anxious for us to write you and tell you that she is unable to write now because she has had the crusts removed from her face and has bandages completely covering her head and face. Only today did they make holes that she could see through. Her Mayo physicians discussed the case at the 1946 meeting of the Minnesota Dermatological Society, and published it 2 years later in 1948. Quoting again from Dr. Brunstein's letter of December 1946, "Such cases as this are rare, and the prognosis is not too good. Evidently, she lacks immunity, as was demonstrated by a complete lack of response to all cutaneous tests of these fungus extracts." At the time of her dismissal, her mother planned to take the young lady to a cabin where she would build up the child's general health in the sun. The medical record provides a final glimpse of the patient 10 years later. A 1956 letter from the University of Oregon Medical School Hospital asking for patient records revealed that she was once again hospitalized, but little else. This reply accompanied the record sent by Mayo. "I am delighted to hear from you regarding the patient. Actually, we have been trying to locate her for the past several years without success. Unfortunately, nothing more is known." By the 1970s, the museum was housed in new quarters in the lower level of the Damon Parkade building. On March 23, 1977, the Mayo Clinic received a letter from a patient who had spent some time in the medical museum between appointments. "Dear Sir, for years I have been telling a story about a true incident involving your Mayo Medical Museum. I was in the museum only a few minutes when a display of 2 wax images caught my attention. I remember this so well that even today I believe that on entering, it was the first display in the second aisle on the right. This particular display was of a woman's face with myxedema before and after treatment. My wife was transforming from an outgoing to a lethargic person, lacking in vitality, gaining weight without eating, and becoming very emotional. Her face was also taking on some of the characteristics of the wax images. On seeing this display and reading the symptoms, I said to myself, 'That's Patricia.' I immediately walked across the street to the clinic and to the first payphone I could find. I called and told her, 'I do not know what Mayo will find wrong with me, but I know what's wrong with you.' I asked her to join me in Rochester as quickly as possible, and she arrived the next day by plane. 3 weeks after testing, the head of the thyroid department confirmed my diagnosis of myxedema from the museum display and commented that he had never seen anyone look as well as she did, but who was as sick as she was. I realized this is a lengthy story, but I did not feel that a short note would fully convey how one display in your museum changed and perhaps saved the life of a fine person and helped her 2 daughters develop normally. And as an aside, both daughters did test positive for myxedema themselves, but it was caught much earlier. And here are close-ups of those 2 before and after models. The thyroid models were almost always on exhibit for 55 years, from 1933 to the day the Mayo Museum closed in 1988. They were always a favorite attraction in the museum. A 1937 newspaper article featured them. You find patients there by the dozens, pointing out to shuddering relatives various steps of an appendectomy, reproduced vividly in wax. They tell listeners with pride, "That's what I had." That popularity continued, as shown in this photograph from the July 1974 issue of the clinic newspaper Mayovox. During April and May, 5,935 young people visited Mayo Medical Museum. On its 50th anniversary in April 1985, the Rochester Post-Bulletin reported that an average of 100,000 people visited the museum every year. However, just 3 years later, the October 26, 1988 edition of the paper announced that Medical Museum closing marks end of an era. The models and the other exhibits were taken down and packed away. The Mayo historical staff is often asked about the models by patients who remember childhood visits to the museum. A few of the models are still on exhibit. 7 are on permanent display in the Patient Education Library, and several others in departmental areas. We also bring them out for temporary exhibits and events, and they were featured in the 2020 Mayo Heritage Days film, Science is an Act of Love, Dr. Giancarlo Rastelli at Mayo Clinic. And here's someone that you should recognize by this point. To close, here is a story submitted to the clinic by one of the hostesses at the 1939 World's Fair in New York. A sweet little old lady was busy with pencil and paper while looking at the Mayo Foundation exhibit. When she finished writing, she offered me this poem. Our innards now are brought to light, to me, a most ungodly sight. And now that I have duly met them, I'll make an effort to forget them. I hope, however, that you will not forget the Mayo Clinic models, and I'll leave you with a poetic effort of my own. Our models have come back to light, I hope a most instructive sight. And now that you have duly seen them, can someone come to help me clean them? Thank you for your invitation and for your attention, and I'm ready to answer any questions.
Thank you for that, Karen. That was enlightening, and I'm glad I'm not eating at the moment. So we did have a couple questions come in, but even as we're talking about these, if you have other questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. And like I said, we'll try and get to as many of them as we can. So the first question we had came in from, I believe, Jenny, and she wanted to know, are the models still used for teaching, or are they currently being used for anything other than display?
No, they're not being used for teaching because they're extremely fragile. We've had some exploration done of doing 3D images of them because we have the 3D scanners now. There's interest, and they certainly are much more lifelike than other synthetic types. And one of the reasons they were stopped being made is that the less expensive synthetic materials could be used to make anatomical models. Plus, there were photographs of that were color, and color was particularly important to things like dermatology teaching. And that was not available until the later, or rather till the early mid 20th century. So the models took that position by showing color.
Okay. And I've seen several questions about this. Are there any plans to put the models on display somewhere?
Well, we would like to. At this point, we have a few in the patient areas. We would be open to perhaps partnering. And they do come out for special occasions. So for instance, several were on exhibit during the sesquicentennial celebrations. We had some open houses that summer, some atrium exhibits. So yes, they are occasionally brought out.
Okay. Why was the museum closed if you had such high visitation numbers?
That's kind of a mystery to me. I keep looking for that. Part of it was because Mayo had moved more toward a less pathology-based type of patient education. And if you think about it, these types of visions, or this view of the body, wasn't really common when the models were being used from the 20s to the 80s. But by the time you get into the 80s and 90s, it's very easy to see pictures, movies, read books about this type of thing. And so the museum They talked about reformatting it and building it in the Siebens basement, but there was a recession that hit, and by the time that the plans resurfaced, it was decided to do a different patient education type of experience, and that's exactly where the patient library is now, in the Siebens subway.
So one of our guests said that they saw an article in the Post Bulletin where models were found in a closet. Are you aware of that story, and do you know the outcomes of it?
No, I actually hadn't heard of that one. So was it a closet at Mayo or at somebody's house?
The question does not say. So Carrie, if you remember any other details from this article, we would love to hear them.
Yeah, I missed that. I do still subscribe to the Post Bulletin, but I'm a little bit behind on it. So
do you still have the models of a smoker's lung that used to be on display in the museum?
oh, the smoker's lung. I think that might have been an actual lung. I have not seen all the models, and the reason that I haven't is because they're packed in these drawers, and again, because they're brittle, the age of the wax makes them more brittle, and they're in the drawers in layers on shelves, and so we're not unpacking them until we actually clean them and rehouse them. We have specially made boxes that are the same size as those drawers, so we could estimate, but it's kind of a surprise what we find when we go into each of them. We have a list, but again, we don't know which ones are still in good shape or might have been taken out and not put back. So that could be a source for the models in the closet.
Are wax models still being produced anywhere?
They are. There is a woman who makes them at the hospital in Berlin. The Karate Hospital has a museum, and she has made models. They also make them in Dresden, Germany. The models are really quite popular in Europe and a lot more well known. They were shocked. In fact, I went to a conference in Europe, in Dresden, to discuss models, and I kind of showed up at the last minute because I hadn't seen the advertisement for it. And when I announced how many models we had and that we have patient records that go with some of them, they were floored and excited too. So yeah. It's a very different, there is one other institution that has them in the sort of numbers, well, there are a couple, but they have patient records with them at the Scott and White Museum also. I'm in contact with people there. And one of the woman who brought wax modeling to Scott and White was a trainee at Mayo. So we're quite closely linked to that collection. Okay.
We did get an update on the Post Bulletin article. Apparently it was in somebody's house, not at the Mayo Clinic. And then Carrie was also wondering if the Visible Man is still on display somewhere.
Yes, it is. That is in the patient library in the Siebens building, where the medical museum might have been had they decided to reconstitute it. The only problem is that his electricity does not work anymore. So he used to light up, so you could see the systems, particularly nerves and blood vessels, but that is no longer functional. That was made, by the way, also for the exposition.
It sounds like they repurposed a lot of stuff from that one exposition.
It's interesting too, because it was so popular that they continued it into 1934. And so over the winter of 33-34, they brought the exhibits back to Rochester, refurbished them, repainted things, freshened things up, and then sent it right back to Chicago. Mm-hmm. And then following the exhibit, they also, the Appendix models ended up in the Field Museum for a while because they were so popular.
Marcia says that she remembers the babies during gestation. Were they part of the wax model collection?
Yes, I believe they were. I have seen a few of those. I'm not sure if the entire exhibit is still there.
Okay. Yeah, we're getting a lot of comments of people like remembering going to the museum as children or specific exhibits, which is great. Paul does say in reference to the smoker's lung we were talking about that it is a real lung preserved in formalin and that it still exists. I really hope that's not hiding in someone's closet.
Yeah, that would be really bad.
So Steve was asking, do they have the other exhibits that were not waxed somewhere? I love the babies. It's a shame that the museum closed, and it was fascinating. It reminds me of a smaller version of the Mutters Museum in Pennsylvania.
Right. Actually, we have more models than wax models than the Mutter Museum, but they have more examples of pathological specimens in formaldehyde. They're well known for that. The Gordon Museum in London is very similar to the Mutter Museum, and it has 5 or 6 levels of that type of specimen. And again, it was a time when people were learning about how the body worked. And so the models would have been very, something really new and exciting to look at, particularly because formaldehyde leaches color. And so this was a way that people could see how things actually looked.
Were there any models of facial prosthetics?
Yes, there are the one model that I showed you from the plastic surgery. There are some of different types of plastic surgery, particularly where they had to, I mean, people literally having cavities in their faces. And I think that's where Dr. Bouboulian got his interest. We do have a donation that came from Dr. Bouboulian's family that shows prosthetics. Essentially, he was using synthetic polymer type materials of different kinds to make ears and noses where people didn't have them. And we do have a prosthetic ear and the mold that he used to make it. So that's a Dr. Bouboulian specialty. But those are not on exhibit. Some of the stuff with patient numbers we have to be very careful about because we have to be conscious of HIPAA. At some point, you know, people can look at this. So for instance, a prosthodontist or maxillofacial doctor might come in and want to see those molds, but we do need to have permission granted from the institutional review boards.
So
something about the other materials as far as other than wax. So grandfather was Leonard Knudsen. And after he retired from Mayo, he had his Knudsen Medical Arts Studio, and he would, interestingly enough, have people that had farm accidents come to him. I don't know if they were referred from Mayo or whatever, but he used to make artificial hands for people and actually paint veins on the hand. They looked like real hands, but they were pliable enough that they could actually hold a pen and sign their name. So
that is so cool. We
Yeah.
have to get together and talk.
Okay.
We have a couple other questions that came in. So Mary Jo Haas says that her father was actually Martin Rossler.
Ah, cool.
And she was wondering if the museum was ever housed in a Quonset hut.
Yes, it was.
Yes.
That was supposed to be temporary because that school building was on the site where the Mayo building stands now. So they they moved the museum from the school building to the Quonset huts, and it took 2 days to move everything. And they moved the exhibits sort of not packaged up, but very carefully. It was quite the operation. And it was there for 13 years until they decided what to do with it. They built that Damon Parkade building, which I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, was opened in 1965. And that was where the museum was then housed. And it had a huge amount of space compared to the Quonset huts. We have photographs of that.
Okay. Did the models ever travel to other parts of the country?
Oh, yes.
outside
Yeah.
of the Chicago Fair?
Well, it's interesting because in the museum records that we have, Mayo always made very extensive and elaborate models or exhibits for the American Medical Association meetings. That was a matter of pride. And so anywhere the American Medical Association had its meeting, Mayo would have an exhibit. And for many, many years, if there was an exhibit, there were usually models. And then the museum staff, the people who actually put those exhibits together, literally built them, would by train travel with the car or the large crates and unpack them and then assemble everything wherever the exhibit hall was for the meeting. And it wasn't just for the American Medical Association. They would repurpose the exhibit. So had there been an ophthalmology visit or exhibit, they would take that to ophthalmology groups, both national and local. So it was really quite an operation. And I did talk with someone who's was a family member of one of the museum people, and they said they would make a family vacation of going with the people to set things up, and the family would travel by train, and then they would just have a good time in the city where the meeting was being held, and that was their summer vacation.
All right. We do have a question. So how does one clean the wax models? You mentioned having to like clean and preserve them.
They're very dusty because those drawers they're not sealed. There's a lot of ways for dust to get into that. And first we vacuum them with a HEPA vacuum, very low intensity suction. And then there is a special type of soap that is also used to clean lab equipment, particularly hoods, I think, that we just mix with clean water. And then mostly it's just me. We use Q-tips and cotton balls and toothpicks with a little bit of cotton on them, whatever we can. We do have to do some repairs. There's a special glue that I was advised to use by people who have collections in Europe. So it's a very time-consuming process. I'm not very far into the collection so far. There's a lot yet to be discovered.
There's other people in the chat that also have either fond memories of going to the museum or relatives that worked with the models. So I will try and put you in connection with them.
Well, they have my email is there, and I would be, if you can put them into contact, and if they want to contact me, I'd love to hear from them. Photographs, if you have photographs of family members working with the models, we'd love to have some more of that. So reminiscences, all that type of thing. It's all good information. We always learn something.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we have another question. This was something I was wondering too. So have the wax models been kept in a climate-controlled environment? It would be a shame if they melted like candles. That was something I was wondering. It's like, at what temperature does this become a candle?
They actually are quite robust in terms of heat. What is a big problem for the models is humidity or swings. And Abby knows this as a curator. It's the damage that's done to artifacts of any kind is when your conditions are not steady. If they swing, if they fluctuate rapidly, that causes material to expand and contract, and that actually ages things and breaks them down. Right now, the models are in a decent environment in terms of temperature, but the humidity is not so good. And that's something that we are working to address. They did not come into our care until 2000, I believe 2003. They had been traveling about the institution a little bit before they found a home with the archives. So there was some damage done because the drawers didn't have padding. that's why some of the models need repairs.
Do you have a favorite model? Or like, what is one that you love to highlight?
You know, I really like a series of models that are intravenous models. Mayo was a pioneer in intravenous delivery of medicine and blood taking, and they're so lifelike. That's one of my favorite series. And I really like I sent you a picture of the brain surgery.
Yep.
And that's another favorite. That's actually one of the staff people whose name, of course, right now escapes me. But anyway, and the woman at the beginning who had the cheek sutures, I'm pretty sure she was a staff member because she showed up in a couple of different series. So they didn't always use the patient, but they used the description or photographs of the procedure, and then a staff person to create the model. However, the plastic surgery ones, they are definite. Most of those are definitely like the people who have the holes in the face, and you know, you can tell when there is an actual person as opposed to one of the staff people.
Do you have any story, like, so now I'm curious, you were talking about HIPAA earlier. Would the patients know that they were being turned into a model? Or
oh, they would have to, yeah. They would be giving their consent. I mean, we don't have consent forms because they didn't anticipate that. But yeah, they didn't kind of sneak up on them with with the plaster. And honestly, I mean, it was something we had to think about. It's not a silly question. I mean, I'm laughing, but you know, you have to sit there and wonder. It's not a comfortable. I mean, think of the film with that poor young man.
Yeah.
And, you know, if you're a patient, on the other hand, if you are someone that has a hole in your face, and this is part of helping people understand how to deal with that, and being told that, you know, by being a person they take a model of, that you're going to help future patients, I think they probably wouldn't have had a lot of people protesting about it.
I was just wondering if there would ever be, you know, like a return patient coming to the museum and being like, wait a minute, that surgery was me.
You know, I have not heard any stories, but I would not be surprised if there were people who did that, especially because a lot of the farm accidents were local. You remember that Mayo, we are such a farming community, and people would come here when they had those accidents. Of course, people will be referred if they had really serious or things that couldn't be dealt with elsewhere. But yeah, I wouldn't be surprised.
So we did have.
And by the way, just that brings up, not all of them were on display at all times. And so some of them may never have actually been in the Mayo Museum itself. They would have just been brought to one of the medical meetings. So yeah, there are some models that never have been shown to the public, just at medical meetings to practitioners.
Do you ever get requests from medical professionals to see a particular model?
We had someone from ophthalmology who was requesting that right at the beginning of the pandemic. So we have not been able to follow up on that, but we will. We haven't heard back from him yet. So, we were looking for specific cardiac conditions for the Heritage Days film, because Dr. Rastelli was famous for creating a procedure called the Rastelli procedure, where there were holes in hearts, and this was how you fixed it. And it's particularly a pediatric type of condition. We were able to find a couple of those models, but I'm not sure that the exhibit, I'm not sure we got all of the models that came back to the exhibit. Some of them went to departments, and I believe the Rastelli procedure might have gone to, I've got clues. It probably went to cardiology, and it, you know, maybe those are the ones that ended up in the closet.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, some of the descendants of people that worked on the models are talking in the chat about how they were used as models themselves,
Oh,
and
really?
that the plaster of Paris was quite cold, which, you know, makes an already uncomfortable situation even worse, I would imagine.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think I'm really hoping maybe we should, when it's summer and we can sit outside, we should have some sort of an oral history session and talk about this, because it's really interesting.
Yeah. Ooh, but it was very smooth, so we didn't have to worry about the plaster of Paris being rough on the skin.
Ooh.
And then there was another story in here from Rachel Bobolian saying that she has a closet of her father's prosthetic ears and noses. A number of years ago, I got a call from an elderly gentleman needing a new ear from my father, not realizing that he had passed away. So I looked through the boxes and found one that he could use. I was concerned about the color matching, but he was thrilled to have one despite it not being a summer tanned ear.
That's great.
But again, if there's any questions from anyone, feel free to put them in the chat and we will keep answering them. You know, these are all really great stories, and I'm glad that you were able to join us.
Well, and people can contact me if they have stories they want to share. Again, email stories or anything that, you know, other questions that are burning and they really want to know about the wax models, they can also contact me via email, and I'll be happy to answer them following the presentation too.
Okay. Yeah, I'll definitely be sure to include Karen's email in our follow-up email tomorrow morning. So that way you'll have it right in your inbox. And I imagine Karen will quickly be overwhelmed with all of the stories and questions, but they're also wonderful stories, and I'm sure she's happy to have them.
Oh yeah, that's a problem I really enjoy dealing with, so that's great.
In a follow-up to the ear story, Rachel said she sensed that the man couldn't afford much, so I told him to send what he wanted, and we would use it to buy a tree in honor of her father. He did and was thrilled about the tree. So that is a delightful ending to the story.
That is so sweet.
Are there any plans to add to the collection? Is Mayo actively trying to get more wax models?
No, these were all made in-house, and I think the trend is for using the 3D printers for making models, and particularly if you remember the separation of the twins that was highlighted at the sesquicentennial that were joined at the chest. They used 3D modeling to map out the surgical steps they were taking to separate the twins. And I think because of the expense of having an artist and the different steps as opposed to the 3D modeling, they don't have plans to do that.
Now, so I'm curious, and I don't know if you would know the answer to this. The 3D printers that I've seen usually only work monochromatically. So like you have to feed each color in individually. Is that a problem for that Mayo Clinic has introduced? Because I imagine you would then just get a blank that you would still have to paint.
You know, what I saw of that particular surgery was that they had used different colors to represent different things. I don't know enough about it to really be able to answer it. But I don't know that they would have taken the same amount of care to make it as lifelike. It was more of a map to how to conduct the surgery. How were they going to separate things? Whose veins belong to whom? That type of thing.
That makes sense. I was just curious.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And we did have an exhibit that had some wax models and some of the 3Ds out. That was, I believe, 2 or 3 years ago in one of the atriums. It was really, really interesting.
We have another question. Are the models being photographed as they're rehoused and cleaned?
Yes. Yeah. we're taking lots of photos. It helps us identify them, and it lessens the amount of handling that we have to subject them to.
Waiting to see if there's any last minute questions. There is a brief discussion on I'm not going to pronounce this correctly, but the origins of Bobulian, whether it's from the Persian word bubble or bulbul, which means nightingale. And Rachel Bobulian says that her great-great-grandfather was a good singer, and they nicknamed him the Bulbul. Otherwise, Dr. Bobulian would be Dr. something else, I think Miss Syrian, but she forgets. So I'm just learning a lot about Dr. Bobulian, and I wish I could have met him.
Oh,
And his
you and me
box of
both.
prosthetic ears.
Well, the whole staff was just amazing, and I again point out that Leonard Knudsen was the first sculptor that was admitted to the Medical Illustrators Association. I'm not entirely sure that a lot of other people were. I suspect Martin Ressler was too, but I don't know for sure. So if his family knows that, that might be interesting. But it was quite I mean, before it was, the people were painters. They were artists of different, they pretty much two-dimensional.
Do you have a sense of about how long on average it would take you to clean a model?
Oh my goodness. It kind of depends on the complexity of the model itself. Some of them are really easy because there's not a lot of this. I mean, you can see with the thyroid gland, if you just look at the fragile bits of that, and you just have to be really careful that you're not knocking things off, with trying to clean them.
Mm-hmm.
Oh my goodness. Probably half an hour to 40 minutes for each of the hearts that I was cleaning. I think I cleaned 48 of those. No, it wasn't 48. Anyway, the hearts were probably about 30 to 40 minutes each. That's pretty
not
interesting.
As long as I was expecting.
Well, even because the hearts weren't as complicated as the thyroid. It just really depends. It's kind of interesting because when we were looking for exhibit a few years ago, I had a volunteer named Sam Edge who helped take some of the photographs in this. And I can remember one day saying, Sam, I can't find my kidney. I was looking for it. And because the drawers have been all mixed up. So you kind of have to go looking for where the particular body parts are. And so you find yourself saying some very odd things at the warehouse when you're looking for them.
Yeah, I can imagine that leads to some interesting conversations.
Oh, yeah.
So John Wells asked, do you ever see 3D copying as a way to replace the old wax models instead of having to constantly do such tedious cleaning and upkeep?
Well, at this point, the wax models are more artifact and work of art than teaching tool. And I think the 3D probably has taken its place in terms of some parts of modern education. The thing that they can't be replaced for is how lifelike they are. And I'd really like to find a nice balance of some way to use them to continue teaching and not have them be handled. I mean, we kind of refer to that in the museum world as being loved to death for some artifacts. I mean, they can't always, wax is also nice because it can be on exhibit for a very long time without being damaged by light. So we would like to see them used more, but we have to be really careful about how we use them.
Would you ever consider loaning them to another museum for display?
They have been loaned. And yes, depending on we'd have to know a lot more about the conditions. I don't think we do it very often, but we would probably do it case by case. It
Would
really
be
would
asked
depend.
sitting in a museum that has exhibits.
Yeah.
Yeah. But no, they're such interesting and yet highly unique artifacts that I imagine that displaying and storing them is an interesting fight all on its own, trying to make sure that they're preserved in the best manner.
Yeah. Well, that's part of the reason it's, I mean, it's somewhere around 15 to 1800. It's a long process.
Mm-hmm. But I think with that, we're going to wrap up. So I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight. Especially thank you to our audience for asking so many great questions, and to our presenter for sharing your time and expertise with us. We hope that you enjoyed tonight's program and that you continue to join us in the future as we discuss everything from the fight for marriage equality to the influenza pandemic in 1918 and so much more. Check out our website, olmstedhistory.com, to keep up to date on all of our new events and programs. And if you enjoyed tonight's program, consider making a donation to help us continue to offer this and other great programs, or consider becoming a member. A History Center of Olmsted County membership offers a wide variety of benefits, including access to free and reduced cost events like this. Thank you so much to everyone who joined us tonight, and we look forward to seeing all of you at our next event. Good night.
Thank you.